We are live. It is Friday, July 10th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, 3 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time, which is relevant to none of us, but maybe to some viewers. It is probably about 10 p.m. Greenwich time, maybe something like that. And it's apparently there's a tropical storm going on in New York. Kate has finally realized that summer has arrived in Cape Cod. And Jonathan Rauch is sitting in the same chair he always sits when he comes on in lieu of fun. We are joined as well by Alex Shepard of the New Republic, it is a pleasure to meet. Before we get started, I just want to say to you all, we are not allowed to have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, we're going to have a debate about free speech, cancel culture, and all that jazz.
I also think that this is so fun. I personally think I couldn't have more fun than this. And I also at the exact same time think that this is the so far from everyone else's idea of fun that I don't like this is so like, I love this so much. I've been looking forward to this all week. So thank you both for coming on.
So here's my concept for this episode. We have Mr. Thesis here, Jonathan Rauch, who is one of the co-signers or the signatories of the Harper'ss letter. And we have Antithesis, Alex Shepard, who is one of the critics of the letter. And so my thought is maybe we should allow Jonathan to state the case, have Alex respond, and just see a conversation develops. And we can just see how few words Kate and I can speak over the next hour. And maybe we will occasionally interrupt to rapture somebody in to ask a question. But basically, I'm kind of in the mood for, Kate's background is the boxing ring. The floor is yours, gentlemen. And ding, ding, ding. Jonathan, you get the first salvo.
And I don't mean to ruin your the entire idea behind what you just said by asking a question. But I wanted to add one quick thing, which is Jonathan, one of the things behind these types of letters that I just want to as a very big picture framing question is and I kind of wanted to ask you this too, Ben and Alex. So I just want to set this also as a level is there are a bunch of different debates about what the substance of the letter is, but there's also kind of this interesting thing happening about open letters and people signing them. They sign them in favor of Joey Ito at the MIT Media Lab, and then all removed their signatures and took down the webpage that supported that. There's been a lot of moments like this, and I'm actually just very interested, and this is me being a little bit of an empiricist and a journalist, what exactly went into the passing about of this letter, the editing of it, the signing of it. I think this is a dangerous part of signing letters. It is one of the reasons that I generally resist signing letters as a lawyer. But I'm just I want to frame that just very briefly as much as we're going to talk about the substance of it, I hope you can address some of that, Jonathan, to whatever extent you can.
Sure, it's as good a starting point as any. I'm very interested in what Alex has to say. I went to look, Alex, at your article. Looks like maybe a takedown of Yasha Monk's new endeavor. I couldn't tell though because TNR is paywalled, so I have to fix that and find out.
I'll give you a login, yeah.
So by pure strange coincidence, all of this stuff broke out as I was actually working on a book chapter specifically on what's now called cancel culture, although I refer to it in my book primarily as coercive conformism. And there's a lot to say about that. And it goes back, in my view, to what I think is the original cancel campaign. We didn't have the vocabulary at the time, but I think it became the template in many ways. And that was the campaign against Salman Rushdie in 1989. The last experience that I had with a letter of this kind was one that I helped to draft in 2014, which was a bunch of supporters of same-sex marriage, gay and straight, objecting to the firing of Brandon Ike, who was briefly, for a period of days, the CEO of Mozilla until some people discovered that he had donated $1,000 to the campaign against gay marriage in California 6 years ago, and he lost his job over that. And the signers of that letter, drafters and signers, including me, said that minorities like us and people advocating a cause like same-sex marriage will not do well if we are either perceived as intimidating or actually do intimidate our opponents. We ought to be persuading them instead, and this is quite unhelpful. So I know a bit about the process of putting a letter together since I did that one. This one, however, I know very little about. All I can tell you is my connection was George Packer of The Atlantic, formerly of The New Yorker. I believe maybe the lead organizer or a lead organizer was Thomas Chatterton Williams, who I don't know. And I got an email saying, will you sign this? I usually don't sign group letters for whatever reason. There's usually more reasons not to sign them than to sign them, but this one was a no-brainer. I read it and said, yeah, I agree with this. It's the right moment. It was just a very easy yes for me. I thought it was a well-calibrated statement. I thought it was carefully non-hysterical. I thought it made the case at the right level of generality without, targeting particular people or debates, which I think is the right way to do it. So I was very happy to sign it, and I think the timing turned out to be propitious.
And did you, are you surprised by the strength of the reaction?
I don't know how to gauge the reaction, but it seems like, Alex might have a better sense because he probably did some scrubbing when he wrote about it. My impression is that yes, it hit at a very good time and got a lot of press coverage. Again, I wrote one of these. It was a smaller group and a different issue, but it got no coverage, right? Most of these letters just sink into oblivion. But this one, yes, this one seemed to get a lot of coverage. It even got coverage of the type saying that the left was having a meltdown over it. So I checked that out. I found like 2 articles denouncing it and a Twitter stream. So apparently that now counts as a meltdown.
So, Jonathan, before we turn it over to Alex, I want to just pose a couple of clarifying questions about, and Kate may have some others, about the affirmative case for this. When I read the letter, I agree with you. It is at a high level of generality. It's not about any one specific case. But that level of generality actually confused me a little bit, because it seemed to conflate people, say, like me, who, say things in the public arena and get attacked in the public arena for them. The sort of Twitter mob response to things that you say. Sometimes the Twitter mob is wrong, and when it yells at me, it is always wrong. And sometimes the Twitter mob is right. I happen to think that, some people say things that offend people and people yell at them, and that's okay. But I don't really see a free speech problem in either of those situations. It's not pleasant to be yelled at, but that's why we go in the public arena. Those situations on the one hand, and people who are actually the subject of professional retribution or some meaningful social consequence that is not speech, just mere speech, because of things that they said that are legitimately within the reasonable public debate. And I guess my question is, do you have a sense of whether that conflation was intentional, or whether it's a kind of inadvertent function of trying to have a very big tent?
I didn't write the letter. My own view on that is that this kind of letter is the wrong place to try to do a philosophical parsing of how you draw the very difficult line between criticism and coercion, social coercion. It's in many cases not going to be clear. Some cases it's very clear. Like Ristretto Roasters, an ordinary coffee roasting company in Portland, Oregon, was driven out of business by a cancel campaign because the owner's wife got on a podcast and talked about due process for in Me Too. That's a very easy case, right? This is an ordinary business that was not even directly connected to the controversial speech. In another case, like J.K. Rowling, you know, she's a huge public figure. She makes controversial statements. Well, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, right? On the other hand, if she's doxxed and people start going to her house, tracking her children, hacking her, if pressure campaigns are put on publishers to boycott her, if her speeches are shouted down and deplatformed, now we're in a different zone, right? We're no longer in the zone of criticism. I guess you want probably short answers, but so stop me here, but you made the mistake of bringing on someone who is writing a book about this and is trying to think through, are there telltale signs, not invariable, but signs that help distinguish between culture of criticism and culture of coercion? And I think there are. One is that if either the goal of criticism or the foreseeable effect of criticism is to cost someone or endanger someone's livelihood or job or position, if people are demanding your head, it's coercive campaign. That includes what happened to Matt Iglesias. Someone said, I'm unsafe working with you, put it online, and then added at the end, by the way, I don't want you fired. Well, that's unhelpful because the way an HR department responds to someone who is unsafe for employees is to fire that person. So that's number one, if your livelihood is in jeopardy or it's targeting your livelihood. Second, is there a secondary boycott? Is the campaign not aimed only at the offender, but at anyone who does business with the offender, who supports the offender? Do they feel endangered? So if I come to the rescue, you know, to the aid, to the support of Alex because of something he wrote, do I then get hit with a campaign? That's not valid criticism. The third is the tone. Is it grandstanding? Is it outrage? Is it ad hominem? Is it abusive? Is it hysterical? Is it repetitive? Same things again and again. Then you're looking at a cancel campaign and not something that looks like criticism. What you're probably looking is people ganging up socially to make someone radioactive. And the fourth thing is epistemic. If what's being said just isn't true, something that goes back to the Rushdie case, which is a template for cancel campaigns, is they don't actually bother to read the work of the person being canceled. In fact, they will say proudly, we didn't read this. We don't have to read it to know it's terrible. Or they'll lie about it. They'll just say stuff that's blatantly not true. Well, if the campaign is detached from reality, if it's actually distorted, if it's lying, if it doesn't care whether things are true or false, then again, you're in cancel realm. So I'd say if it's like two or more of those things, then yeah, then it's a problem. Then it's the kind of discourse, you know, it shouldn't be illegal, but it should not be praised.
All right, Alex, the floor is yours. What's wrong with this letter?
Well, I think, you know, we're talking about generalities here. And for me, that's really what stuck out. And I think if you want to have a conversation that's based on empiricism and agreeing on a certain framework, that's really important to do. And I think that this letter was particularly weaselly on those grounds in particular, and that one could easily read between the lines here and see what these people were talking about. And I think in many cases conclude that specificity would in some ways damage the argument, right? That this was an attempt to, I think, push through some, I think, quite complicated issues, particularly things like James Bennett's firing, or Ian Baruma, who signed the letter, his firing from the NYRB. That, I think, is one particular issue that I had, because I think that actually going through and wringing out these examples is really important. But the other issue is that work needs to be shown. I think the level of this argument to me is entirely based on sort of anecdotal stuff. The people involved are, for the most part, quite powerful, and they can sort of gesture at these issues. There are, I think, Yasha Monk's story about 3 people who lost their jobs over cancel culture. That's a great example. Reading that article, you're like, this is horrible. Does it rise to an issue of this extraordinary moment of attack or an assault, this extraordinary assault on free speech from the left? I just don't think so. I think comparing this to the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, for me, like, that's where I sort of check out. I think in some ways I'm someone who is instinctively sensitive to some of the issues that John was raising, but I really get frustrated when I hear these issues then collapsed into this larger question of the assault on free speech at this moment, which, I think this is an extraordinary moment given the person in the White House and the party that controls one branch of Congress. But you need to show your work if you're going to make claims like that. And I think John has done some of that here, although for the most part, I think it's still dependent on the realm of anecdotes. But also, there's always this slippery slope, right? That J.K. Rowling is bringing, for instance, who John raised, is bringing up, arguments that people who have followed trans issues, have been arguing over for years. Like, I personally think those are discredited arguments, that we've gone through this via the, marketplace of ideas. And it just so happens that there's this social media thing that we have now that means that we're perpetually having the same argument over and over again. And for me, that's the thing that we need to address. As for the question of whether or not someone tried to get Matt Iglesias fired over this, I think that too, to me, was also completely overblown. I thought that the letter that Emily wrote was actually quite thoughtful, and I think many people's response was to call her a liar. I don't think that John's doing that and is bringing up that there are some potential HR complications. But I think that, you can go and say, oh, well, we had this high-minded idea, and people then try to get Matt Iglesias fired. Well, Emily was dealing with death threats for the last 36 hours, right? Like, these are not mutually exclusive things. And I think the idea that these people have this monopoly on this sort of moral high ground of free speech, not only do I not buy it, I think that they need to show their work.
So so that audience knows the reference point here, what happened with this person, Emily, and Matt Iglesias?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, John, if you can certainly disagree with my characterization. Matt Iglesias, a writer at Vox, very prominent person at the company, I believe a co-founder, I think someone who's...
He is a co-founder, yep.
Yeah, very interesting point of view, an enormously powerful figure, somebody they associate with Vox, signed the letter, which was also signed by a number of people who are well known for pushing on trans issues and sort of making these kinds of, again, in my opinion, bad faith arguments that they should be able to debate whether or not someone is who they say they are, or whether or not someone is crazy for saying they are who they say they are. And she said that his presence on this letter made her feel unsafe. It's a public letter. It's, that this was made, that there was a public response to it, I think was what people deemed offensive, which to me is somewhat confusing. But that was the extent of it. In the letter, she said, I don't want there to be consequences. I don't even want an apology. I just want you to know how this made me feel, which I think is an important thing and is worth airing in public. And to say that that's not appropriate, I think that that's somehow canceling Matt's speech. It seems like we've inverted the idea of sort of protect, who the minority is here in this really bizarre way, where suddenly it's, David Brooks and Matt Iglesias.
Before Jonathan answers, I just kind of want to lay in some groundwork about the letter and what it says and everything else and how it has generally been interpreted in my understanding, which of course you guys can color in. But also kind of want to kind of lay in the groundwork for some of the stuff that Alex talked about, because this is my area of expertise, which is this kind of the shaming culture of the internet, and how people have been shamed online in the last 20 years and how that has changed the nature of shaming and online speech. I wouldn't call it cancel culture. I would call it kind of online shaming. You've got everything from your Justine Sacco, who was a woman who was just a regular old PR person who was picked up by whose tweet about very kind of like not funny tweet about AIDS was picked up by Gawker, and when she landed, she tweeted it right before taking off for South Africa from New York, and when she landed, there were people there to meet her plane, and she'd been fired from her job and everything else. So like this woman these things have been happening to people for decades, and that's not to say that it's good or bad. It's just that these are things that have been slowly mounting, and it's in part because of the access that we all have to amplifying our speech and the infinity nature of speech on the internet, that things never go away, the cheapness of communication and liking things or like not liking things, the anonymity that is created by all of these accounts, so you can like or like post anonymous speech, and so all of these things kind of accentuate this. And to your point, Alex, I think that what you're kind of saying is like, to you, this letter was in some ways like power recapitulating power. It was people who have like a platform and a voice, like signing this letter and doing these other things, and then like people like Emily are just like, writers of Vox doing their job and they feel unsafe, and then they're kind of, but I would say that like to a person, everyone I've talked to when I've interviewed someone that has been shamed online, whether they are literally already a public figure or not, really feel completely overwhelmed and like want to kill themselves, like, or like contemplate suicide, or like really just like it is just so overwhelming to have that level of hate turned on you, and that like that kind of thing turned on you. And to that extent, I think what Jonathan is talking about is this idea that like when you risk having that level of hate turned on you, be it doxing or just like, or anything, or just like 1,000 people telling you to jump off a bridge and how ugly and stupid you are, or like whatever it is, like it's much worse than that, as we all know, that like it stops you from talking, and you self-censor, and that people don't say like controversial things. And so like I think that is a little bit the debate, that's why we're having this conversation in an age of social media. But go ahead, Alex, and then Jonathan, I'd really like to hear what you have to say.
Oh, I was just gonna say most of that I agree with, and I wish that the letter did that, instead of, I think, kind of hand waving at a bunch of issues, and not, I think, having the temerity to defend what they were actually talking about. And I think that is yeah.
What do you think they were actually talking about?
I mean, I think you can go through and point at some of these examples, although it's slightly confusing. I mean, I think they cite 5 or 6, right? There's the, firing of editors for sloppy mistakes. Well, you would say that that's James Bennett and Ian Baruma. I think that is a willful mischaracterization of what happened at both the NYRB and the New York Times. You had a bizarre claim about people pulling books, which I have no idea what they're talking about. Possibly the controversy over American Dirt, possibly some stuff within YA fiction, which is honestly so confusing and bizarre that I don't know it is worth delving into. But it certainly isn't. It doesn't reach the point of national crisis, right? And this is, there's Orwellian language in this. We're comparing this to the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, and those two examples.
Well, to be fair, Salman Rushdie is comparing it to the fatwa.
Yeah, that is.
Sorry.
And I think he does have a certain, if he sees a certain similarity.
Well, now
I think he has standing to raise that question.
Sure. Yeah.
But
I'm doing the thing that I'm accusing the other people of doing. So,
but we give you lots of credit for acknowledging that. Jonathan, I would love to hear kind of your response to that.
Well, it would help me to just clarify, Alex, make sure I understand where you're coming from, which is, it sounds like you're saying that this letter was not executed as well as you wish it had been, but you're not saying that there's no problem, that this is like an imagined phenomenon of crybabies who have a lot of power and don't want to be criticized, which is something that some people have said. Am I understanding you correctly, or are you in fact saying that there's really no serious social problem here and that no letter should have been written at all?
I think I'm saying 2 things, right? I'm saying that this is a group of I believe coddled elites who I think are largely concerned about a loss of status. And in many cases, one of, I think, the unspoken things here is that there are other people within their workplaces who are speaking up in ways that they certainly wouldn't have 10 or 20 years ago. But on the other hand, I do think that there is some social problem. I just think that the issue for me looking at it is that this is not I don't necessarily see it as this problem of free speech on the left. I think that there's a genuine problem with discourse on social media, right? And the exhaustion of it, and this sense of not being able to both agree on the rules, but also of just having the same debates over and over again forever. I think the idea that we can somehow return to this mythical world of, kind of pure reason, it's impossible to have within the social media world. But that the letter to me didn't do that. It was saying this is a bunch of leftists who are mean to me online, and I just don't think the data supports it. And I think it also collapses what I think of as being genuine empirical criticism of people like J.K. Rowling into, oh, well, she also got death threats, right? And those are obviously horrible, but that doesn't escape the fact that I think the criticism that she receives is deserved.
Yeah, it's hard to sort through all that. And honestly, it's a little bit hard to tell what you're saying. It seems like you're saying on the one hand, there is a real problem. And then you're saying on the other hand, but it's not a big problem. And a lot of people who say there's a problem don't really have a problem because they're powerful. So I think we need more clarity than that, right? So I think there's a problem. I think the nature of the problem combines the facilitation that social media provides for instant reactions and huge pylons, something that has never been possible in the same way in human history. You could do it in a small community, but now you can have 10,000 people all of a sudden overnight, and they can focus on targets who are just ordinary people, or they can focus on J.K. Rowling. So that's something new. So you put a very powerful tool in people's hands. And second, you also have something that I think is new and worrisome, which is that folks have discovered that they can put significant pressure on employers and institutions, universities, credentialing organizations, of course, employers. And if they can make people radioactive enough, if they can get enough people to say, Alex Shepard is a racist, a homophobe, a Nazi, whatever, doesn't have to be true. A lot of these organizations will say, well, there's a lot of writers I can hire other than Alex Shepard. So Alex, I don't think we'll be using you as a freelancer anymore. And then 9 or 10 people do that. And then your friends start seeing all this stuff about you. All they know, they don't read all your work. 1 or 2 of them will say, hang in there, Alex, be brave. But most of them will say, I don't really think I need to invite Alex to the next dinner party because people are saying he's a Nazi. So you get all this stuff going on with your friends. Another sure sign of cancel culture going on is if you approach people and they say things, or people approach you and say things like, Alex, I support you, but I can't say that in public. Or if they say they support you in private and then say the opposite in public, that tells you there's fear in the air. So I think we're seeing that. I couldn't document how much of it we're seeing, but I think we're seeing it. I can document that in academia, we're seeing a lot of it because we do have some survey evidence from academia about what professors say versus what they think, and about the climate of opinion there. And there it's not a function of social media, by the way. It's a function of campus culture and the lack of intellectual diversity. So one ideological group can exert a whole lot of pressure on perceived dissenters. So that phenomenon is a social phenomenon. It's not a legal phenomenon. It can hit the great or the small, but even a great important writer like J.K. Rowling, she's diddly squat if publishers won't have anything to do with her, if they turn her off.
I don't think that's true.
I mean, she does have billions, millions and millions of dollars.
Well, sure, she's not going to starve, but so another thing that often comes up is these are privileged people. Well, they're not rich people for the most part. Most of them are highly dependent on the marketplace of ideas for their jobs. They're dependent on employers. So they're actually very vulnerable people in many cases. And of course, the people who are going to be involved in public debate, people like Ben or me, are typically going to be people with college degrees who don't work in factories. So that's not really a very meaningful distinction. I think the whole point of having an open climate of opinion where a lot of voices can be heard is that you don't say, well, we're not worried about this person being heard because of their income level or where they live or where they went to college. I think you just want to say people should be heard without having to worry too much about being boycotted or turned socially radioactive. So at that level, I think it's actually kind of a simple proposition that doesn't need the kind of fine detailed parsing that you may be asking for, Alex.
Okay, can I want to try to narrow the area of disagreement here and just throw a few specific cases at you both and see if we can identify where the disagreement actually arises. So let's start with Yasha Monk's examples. Do you both agree that the Civis employee who was fired for retweeting an academic article by an African-American Princeton professor about the efficacy of violent versus nonviolent protests during the civil rights movement, that is an example of a problematic or if that's what we're talking about, that raises a serious free speech problem. Not a First Amendment problem because it's a private employer, but that is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, there are contextual things that are missing there, but everything that I know about that, it's objectionable. I think the point that I read about in this article is, I think what critics need to do is to make the case that there's a leap between this guy gets fired from Civis for doing X to this is causing this immense crisis in free speech, right? And that I don't know I just don't know how we get there.
Right, but you're not gonna defend what happened to him.
No.
Okay. The other Yasha Monk case is a driver for I think San Diego Gas and Electric whose hand dangles out of his window and falls into some kind of an OK sign, apparently randomly. Somebody snaps a picture of it, tweets that he's a racist, and it's a white power sign. There's a kind of mob, and he is fired, and he doesn't know what hit him because he wasn't trying to communicate anything, let alone a white power sign. I take it that's sort of in the same category, a sort of drive-by attack on a rando.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about all three of these examples in the piece, but yeah.
Okay, so, and then similarly, from the other side, do you both agree, leaving aside the death threats, do you both agree that if J.K. Rowling enters into the political arena with a series of highly provocative, I'll leave to others the question of whether they're bigoted, but they're objectively provocative, right? A series of highly provocative comments about trans people and gender and biology, and a lot of people are mad at her and express their anger on Twitter, and the result of that is a certain social shaming, that there's nothing wrong with that. Again, leaving aside the death threats and that's actually debate. Is that fair?
As stated, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jonathan, you caveated that with as stated. So where is the point in the J.K. Rowling story where you start to get uneasy?
So two things, and I don't know if they apply in her case. But, and I'll preface this by saying I think your analysis is basically correct, but I'd only enter the two following footnotes. One is, I understand from one Tamara Wittes, an expert who you may
Wise
know.
woman.
Yeah, and brilliant.
That's Ben's wife, everyone. Sorry.
Oh, I didn't know that. That one
Yeah,
of the
we
things that
we
happened
have this
there
connection.
is that some people at Rowling's publishing house who worked there said that if they continued to publish her, that they would do something. I don't know what it was, quit or something. That's deplatforming, and that's not a good place to go. That's not the way publishers should be making those decisions, I think. So that would be a small reservation, a minor one. But the second thing is, so J.K. Rowling enters the arena. She gets a lot of heat. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. The caveat I would enter is if what she's getting is 10,000 instances of hate, basically, content-free hate, in a targeted campaign, that is different from having to interact with people who disagree with your point of view. We're no longer talking about a conversation. We're talking about a campaign of outrage in which J.K. Rowling is the target. She's simply the object of a campaign by people to demonstrate solidarity in a kind of almost religious way. So I would say let them do that. I would say she should have been, that was a predictable thing. But I would also say that is not the way I like to see civic discourse. And I don't actually think it is discourse. I think it's display, not discourse. So just a caveat.
Okay, so let me amplify that caveat a little bit and turn it back to Alex, because I have been the subject of a kind of interesting variant of this, which is that, and just to be clear, I don't make offensive remarks about trans people. But I did once entertain, I was a friend of Brett Kavanaugh's for many years, and I expressed warm feelings about him at the time of his nomination. I think I am alone among his friends to revisit that in a public way at the time of Christine Blasey Ford's allegations, but I did support his nomination at first. And similarly, when Bill Barr was nominated, I think quite tepidly thought that was the least bad option under the circumstances and said that. Now, in doing that latter thing, I was in extremely broad company among kind of mainstream, including Democrats, people like Preet Bharara and whatnot. But uniquely among this group of people, I am reminded of it in my Twitter feed whenever I say anything on any subject. So if I say, Alex Shepard will be on In Lieu of Fun tonight, someone will respond, yeah, but you supported Bill Barr, or you vouched for Brett Kavanaugh. And I became convinced that this was an organized thing. And I did a fair bit of empirical research, which I've published about, how consistent it is, how consistent the verbiage is. And I am fairly convinced that it's some kind of an organized disinformation effort. And so just to amplify Jonathan's caveat, I wonder I agree that when, millions of Harry Potter readers are upset with J.K. Rowling over her comments about trans people, it is more than appropriate for them to express that. But I do worry that these reactions give a very powerful opportunity for organized, not always well-intentioned messaging, some of which can be true, false, or partly true, that people end up injecting certain ideas into the bloodstream and making them pervasive without people really knowing or understanding where they're coming from. And so I'm interested in your sense of what the limits are in the grassroots organic reaction to J.K. Rowling. Okay, so everybody should express that they're angry, but where does it stop?
Well, I think, for me, this, at least as a social phenomenon, started with Gamergate, which I think was in 2014. This is sort of organized effort that came from Reddit by, we would call them right-wing misogynists. It was mostly focused on harassing women, particularly women of color who worked in the gaming industry. And I think that at the time, some of the more prescient commentators looked at this and said, this is the future of discourse, right? This is where it's all heading. And those people were 100% right, right? And I think that, to a large extent, is what happens now, where we're stuck in this sort of Groundhog Day of discourse, wherein anything that you raise, someone will come back and just try to start the same argument, right, that you've had hundreds and hundreds of times. And my frustration with the Rowling argument is that I, in fact, think that she is engendering a lot of this by basically, going back and endlessly rehashing anti-trans debates, right? And that basically then people like Emily and other people who I think are very patient and, kind people, which is what we should all aspire to be, are then told to endlessly repeat their defenses of these things in good faith. And they have to, and when in fact these arguments are being raised, I think, repeatedly in bad faith. And I think, J.K. Rowling is one of the letter signers for whom I think I have a problem with this. But I think that this is a discourse problem. I don't know if it's necessarily like an illiberalism problem, right? Like, we suddenly have this thing wherein you say something and you'll get hundreds of trolls and it's repetitious and it's awful and it basically prevents anyone from having a meaningful conversation online. But it, the thing that keeps losing me with all of this is that I don't even really know if this has to do with the culture of ideas. And, as much as I like to dress up my frustration with the people who tweet at me in highfalutin ideas, I think the problem is much baser than all this. And that in some ways it's polluted by this high discourse.
Okay, so one more case where I think you guys have been admirably agreeable on the edge cases. So now let's talk about some of the internal cases. The two editors, Ian Baruma and the one man who has ever fired me from anything, James Bennett, who fired me as a contributing editor to The Atlantic after canceling my column, wrote me a letter saying that I hadn't contributed in a while, and so he was removing me from the masthead. So I don't have, any, I don't want to carry water for James Bennett, but both of them have in common that they were editors of elite opinion writing entities. Both of them published something that turned out to be, maybe they should have known, but certainly in retrospect, they regretted publishing. Both were relieved of their jobs. Is that okay, Jonathan and Alex?
Me first, I guess. No, it's not okay. They aren't the edge cases. They're not the easy cases. And I should say, full disclosure, I'm compromised by knowing both of those people for many years and having worked with and for both of them. So take what I say with a grain of salt. In both of those cases, it seemed to me try to think this through, because they're somewhat different. In both of those cases, valid concerns, in fact, obviously valid concerns were raised, but the way they were handled sent the message, you can't say that stuff here, intentionally or not. I think that's what came across. I think that's harmful for journalism. And I think when these things happen, when people on a staff are genuinely upset and have reason to be upset about an editorial decision, the first thing you do is talk about that inside, right? When you go outside and when you begin recruiting outside voices, and those outside voices are calling for someone's head, and when you begin to get advertisers saying, as happened, I'm told, at the New York Review of Books, we're pulling our ads because this article ran and or because you're now controversial in a way we don't want to be associated with, you start bringing to bear this outside social pressure on the journalistic organization, which is of a very different sort than having a necessary internal conversation, how this should have handled. Did we fact check enough? Should the op-ed editor read everything that goes in before it goes in? What if he had and it still approved it? So these are hard questions. A second thing that bothered me about the Bennett case very specifically is that the safety card was played. I am not a fan of the emotional safety argument. I think it's a pernicious attack on liberal norms of free expression. Almost anything could be perceived by someone for any reason or claimed by anyone for any reason to make them feel unsafe. And in today's workplace context, saying someone makes you feel unsafe is a human resources problem. It's a workplace problem. I feel threatened, brings lawyers into the picture. But above all, for journalists, it seems to me, journalism is not a safe profession. And as a professional journalist, I was a little bit shocked to see hundreds of people saying, I don't feel safe at a newspaper that would run a conservative op-ed piece I disagree with that has X and Y flaws. That also moved it over the line to me. But as you say, these are not edge cases. These are cases in the middle where we ought to be discussing them.
Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I come from the opposite point of view. I think on both counts, actually, I think on the advertiser one as well. I understand certainly the fear of these sort of boycott campaigns going out of control and being used to put publications that are contrarian or flouting various norms out of business. Fox News has been dealing with these campaigns in a very concerted effort for quite some time. That's I think the biggest example I can think of. It's doing fine. I think also in both of these cases, though, to talk about this as a journalistic issue, one of the things that they revealed for me about both editors, with a caveat, of course, that I don't know them both, and I certainly know that they, have strong reputations with many people, but what they also revealed was not just flaws within the editorial process, which were, discussed very publicly and acknowledged, but also I think a real lack of curiosity, right? Not just a lack of empathy, which I think is a larger problem in some cases, but they were not, Baruma, when pressed with the specifics of the story, basically said, I had no interest in learning about what other people have to say about this person, right? And James Bennett, basically said, I had nothing to do with any of this at all. And what you saw at the Times, I think, was also to some extent, a vote of, confidence. Now, whether or not you think that that's appropriate, I think is a labor question. I don't necessarily know if it's a speech question, but I do think one of the other issues, which is related, and it's something that I talk about with some particularly older colleagues, not necessarily at TNR, but at other places, is I think the fear of what happened at the Times, which is essentially that voices that have not traditionally been particularly loud within these organizations, younger journalists, particularly people of color, women, were speaking up. They were the leaders of this campaign against James Bennett. And I mean, I guess I'm sort of playing a slightly different rhetorical card, but I do think that one of the things that was boiling over there is that, in journalism, we have not traditionally listened to these people very carefully. And that I think doing so is beneficial to the industry, and that matters.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I've worked in newsrooms. People get listened to. They have all kinds of ways to express themselves. And In this case, I think there was a further journalistic ethics problem in that what you had here is newsroom employees jumping the traditional firewall and saying, we object to something the editorial side has run. They objected to it because they disagreed with it, right? There were other problems with it, but they would not have objected to it if it had been on the other side of the issue and if it said, don't send in the military. And they said, we're very upset that you ran that, and we're going public with how we're upset about it. We're going to campaign against it, and we're going to say it made us unsafe. Well, imagine if you flip that over, right? Imagine if the editorial page staff had run a public campaign against a decision that had been made by the city editor and gotten someone fired over there. You know, the newsroom would be up in arms around that. So these are all issues that I think, in my mind, trump the issues of were these junior employees or senior employees.
I understand that. I think, but this, I guess, rhetorically is always one of the concerns that I have with, I think, this approach in general is just, you know, it's just a succession of slippery slopes, right? And like, we've been on them to some extent with speech issues now for, you know, God knows how long, probably since the invention of the teenager, but, you know, since '68. And, you know, I mean, look, I'll put my cards on the table. I was educated at the Maoist collective of Oberlin College, right? And
So was I.
Oh,
What year?
2009.
You were a little after my time.
But I think, you know, certainly, yeah, I always love to read about Oberlin College, but one of the things that's always shocking to me is how different the things I read about it are than my own experience there. And that you can go back and find stories about how the cultural vandals of Oberlin are coming to your HR department and they're going to get you fired. And, you know, maybe I'm wrong. And maybe, John, when I get fired for all this stuff, you can come and dance on my grave. But I think the thing that's always striking is everyone's always warning that this is about to happen. It's about to happen. Shit, you know, we're finally going to do it.
Finally going to do what?
We're finally going to cross over into, you know, pitchforks and Maoism, and
but
you know, I'll be trying you and Ben, you know, and I'll feel bad about it, but you know.
But like, I think that to a certain extent, and we do have to go to questions, and we have a bunch of really good questions, but I think to a certain extent, what Jonathan is saying, and I have sympathy for, and I went to Brown, so all of you are like idiots compared to me. I might as well have gone to Wesleyan. I mean, like not idiots, but like no one understands this culture better than me.
No. Brown and Wesleyan are pretenders to the throne.
Oh, really?
You guys are not isolated in a cornfield in Ohio.
That's true.
I mean, look, I'll just no, this is a different conversation, but
okay.
But we have you beat. I promise. Okay.
Anyways, I just want to say that like I do think that there is a certain amount of like you don't, and I'm not trying to like I don't like this argument. I don't think it's a particularly strong one, but I will say that like if you that Alex, like, have you ever wanted to say something on the internet that you thought in your heart of hearts was true or accurate, but yeah, stop saying it because you were afraid of what someone was going to respond? Like you read something and you were like, I don't like this. I think this is full of shit. Like, I think this is a really basic, stupid argument, but you didn't say it. And I think that that's like, I'm curious about that because I do that a lot. And I stop myself from talking because I'm afraid. Now I'm a law professor. I'm doing whatever. I don't know. Like, I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think, you know, I've dealt with online mobs too, and like they suck. Like they make you feel horrible. And I always have, this is going to make me just sound like I'm completely, I'm like in a Clockwork Orange or something. But I do see these mostly as learning experiences to some extent, right? And I've gotten them from the right and the left, and there are times, I mean, they're trust your gut issues for me too, right? Where there are times where I'm like, you know what, like I effed up and shouldn't have done this, and there are other times where I'm like, this is the dumbest thing in the world, and I can't believe I'm wasting my weekend dealing with it. But I don't necessarily think that we're all on the verge of being canceled, right? I think we really do we do misconstrue like the fact that the internet is full of mobs with I think the thing that John is talking about, which is genuinely awful when the like economic mob comes for you, right?
I think the economic mob is closer than maybe you think, but like I also agree with you that like I think that you take on certain types of stuff, as John said about J.K. Rowling, is like you walk into the fire, like you know, you're on Twitter and you're voicing your opinion and like whatever. But I think that like maybe we could like to put it in a list of punishments, because we don't have due process anymore, especially not on the internet. A list of punishments like losing your actual job and your income and your ability to support your family might be at the high end of like maybe not what should happen for voicing an opinion, depending on various roles. But like that's like I think one thing that maybe we could kind of agree on, which I think, Alex, you actually agreed to earlier.
I mean, I don't think any of the people that I know who are on the who are cancel culture skeptics, I would say, would necessarily contest that. I think my worry is more that this, again, I admire John's good faith, but the thing that I encounter so often is this argument being wielded in bad faith ways. And I find it to be really frustrating in a way that shuts down discourse, right? And that's the issue for me.
And Jonathan, you came at this from a perspective, I think, of like having fought for gay rights and having fought for civil rights for gay people for a long time. And you're certainly kind of on the cusp of that. And so I don't know. I do think that like you kind of have a unique perspective of like if there's going to be some type of backlash to a certain type of rogue culture or like new culture, that like you would have some like sympathy or empathy for that. You're muted, babe. You're muted.
The two ubiquitous words. I self-edit all the time. I choose my fights. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't say everything that's on my mind. So it's always a question of limits, right? And there are some things which I do say, I might check with someone. I might make sure all the hatches are battened down. And there's some fights I'll avoid altogether. And that's all up to a point. That's all part of a healthy discursive environment. I think when things change is when you have the concentration of essentially 1,000 voices saying, would it be offensive to say, I don't know, Kate, you're an effing bitch? Saying, Kate, you're a Nazi, just lying about you. You know, all of these things take it to a different level. And that, to me, should not be a super controversial issue. And whether the problem is quite significant, as I think it is, or whether it's not as significant, I would still think this letter would be a positive contribution.
Well, you certainly sparked a dialogue with it. And, you know, we have spent our Friday night with it. So, you know, I'm personally happy, as we discussed earlier. We have 3.
But it wasn't fun.
Wait,
No,
I had
you're not
fun.
allowed to have fun on this show.
No fun.
Hey,
no fun. Alex is smiling. Just make him stop smiling. Like, stop with your free speech, Alex. No smiling. We have Mike Godwin to ask the first question, Daniel Burge to ask the second question, and Sam Mon Malu I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, to ask the third question. We're going to do them in kind of lightning round style because we're almost out of time. Well, we're out of time, but like we're going to go a little over because, you know, time doesn't matter anymore because we all live in tiny boxes on our computer. Mike Godwin, go ahead. I love your question. You have to mute yourself, Mike. Please. Wait. Oh, wait. There we go. Mike, hello. There you go.
Here I am. So,
hi.
So, Jonathan has mentioned Nazis twice in this discussion, so I had to show up. No, really, he has. So, Emily's letter, the thing about Emily's letter, and I had a great amount of empathy for Emily's public letter and for her response to the reaction. But it's ironic, right? Because she has been the target of a cancellation effort, right? Emily posted something that was critical of Matt Iglesias signing the letter, and then she got a bunch of shit, right? And really unreasonable amounts of shit. So in a sense, even though Emily was, responding to the fact that Matt Iglesias had signed a letter that J.K. Rowling had also signed, the fact is she wrote this public letter in which she was careful to say, I'm not trying to seek revenge on Iglesias. I'm just trying to say this made me unhappy. It made me uncomfortable. And she's got a bunch of shit. So in a way, ironically, even though she's protesting Iglesias is signing the letter about cancellation culture, or whatever that is, or whether it's mentioned or not in the letter, the fact is she's been the target of it. And I would love you guys to comment on the fact that Emily's letter actually, in a weird way, proves that there's some validity to the letter.
Okay, that is an awesome question, Mike. Thank you for asking it. But we're gonna go to, before I let them respond, Daniel, the floor is yours. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, for Alex, what's your standard of evidence to establish there's a problem?
Okay, and Sam, do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, there was discussion of Rushdie, and my thought was that seemed very inopposite, given that it involved Iranian state action. It was Khomeini who actually read the fatwa on television, where the letter's complaints don't seem to be about state action at all. I think, as Benjamin said earlier, it's not a First Amendment issue. So this seems to me more a discussion about, a desire for civility and a distaste for having consequences to speech, sort of dressed up as free speech.
Great question, Sam. Thank you so much.
Great. All three are great questions. So, Alex, why don't you start us out and address any combination of those questions that is on your mind, and then we'll have Jonathan do the same.
Also, if you need to look at them physically, they are in the Q&A.
I think I have it in my head.
Okay.
I want to thank Sam, because I was doing the thing again. I was criticizing with the letter and hand waving around this, but that was the point I was trying to make about Salman Rushdie, who I knew signed the letter. The second point about the standard of evidence is, I think, a really interesting one, and something that I think about a lot. I think that the big issue that I have with this is the elevation of this into this sort of pressing free speech issue, particularly in this moment, right? We're talking a lot about due process in particular. And I mean, I wrote about this with Yasha Monk, but I think that there's something that borders on the macabre about doing so in a moment where historical protests have been breaking out across the country over this issue of due process and the lack of it for police officers and in particular. But, I think that the proponents of the letter, for the most part, still cite what I would consider to largely be isolated instances. And I think that John and I see the same things. And for me, they just don't necessarily rise to this world historical thing. And certainly my bigger fear is that they're being used to discredit the sort of left, right? And that, you see today that the president is talking about removing the tax exempt status of universities. This is a backdoor, I think, for those kind of arguments. And I think there, it's, once you open that door, there are a lot of bad people there. On the question of the letter, I think that that's an interesting point. One of the things I would just add to it is a sense of, well, not disappointment, but certainly not surprise that letter was immediately taken, and I think an extraordinarily glib and, in my opinion, dehumanizing in the ways that I think John and myself agree are bad for the internet by some of the letter signers, as proof that of course they were right, which then allowed many of their followers to descend on this person and harass them. I think I'm sensitive to the lack of good faith argument. I don't necessarily think it's possible on Twitter, but I think for a bunch of people to sign a letter calling for more good faith argument and then immediately seize upon the first sort of vague example of what they were talking about, and essentially, not essentially, they did call Emily a liar, which I don't think is true. That I think, you know, I would certainly be disappointed if I signed a letter like that and saw people behaving that way.
So,
Jonathan?
a lot there. The Rushdie case is easy. No, that was not state action. That was action by a state actor, but state action would have meant Rushdie is indicted, his extradition is requested, and he's put on trial in Iran for a capital offense. What in fact happened there was international terrorism, in which Muslims all over the world, in every country, were urged to assassinate Salman Rushdie and anyone who supported or associated with him. Clearly not state action. And although we're talking here about physical murder and not social murder, which are obviously very different, the structure of the thing is the same, which is an individual says something that's disliked and a massive campaign is mounted to target that person across all international borders in an overwhelming way. The common thread here is social isolation, radioactivity, make it very dangerous for others to associate with this person. I'm not equating death with you ignorant slut. I'm not doing that. But this is clearly something other than traditional state action. Standard of evidence, we'll have to agree to disagree on how bad things are out there. I can give you chapter and verse on academia, as I say, and look for that in a book I'm trying to finish. Kate's going to help me with that, right, Kate?
Yeah, I'm supposed to read 2 chapters, and I'm going to do it. I really am.
I might have to send you the cancel culture chapter too when it's done.
Actually, I would be really good at that. Yeah.
But there you clearly have an academia when professors are asked, are there things you won't say in the classroom because you're afraid you'll be reported? For example, they're saying yes. They're saying, questions are asked, do you think a student would come directly to you with a problem, or would they report you to higher authorities? They're saying, about half of them say they'll go directly to higher authorities and investigation might start. So that's another peculiar quality of these campaigns. They don't go directly to the person and say, hey, I have a problem with that. In a conversational way, they'll go through social media, which is peculiar. Yeah, I think I basically agree with you, Mike, about the letter. You know, that I disagree with those who say that the letter, can't remember her last name. I apologize. We're calling her Emily, I guess.
Should we just actually call her Emily? Because I would prefer she not have like a whole like. Yeah, I think it's better. Let's call her Emily.
We'll just call her Emily, and I don't even remember her last name. But I thought that letter was totally inappropriate because it wasn't just criticism. It said, I'm going to the HR department with a complaint about this. It made me unsafe, and I'm telling the world, thus recruiting the unpredictable forces of the entire internet to get involved. And when you do that, you are like an arsonist saying, well, I'm going to light the fire, but I hope the house doesn't burn down. So I thought that was very irresponsible. That said, I do not support any of the stuff that's happened to her. And I agree with Mike that the whole friggin' thing shows the toxicity of the environment that we're in.
We are going to leave it there. Jonathan Rauch, Alex Shepard, thank you so much for joining us and engaging in this civilized debate and discussion about uncivilized debate and discussion and its consequences.
Do I get a prize for being on 3 times? That's not the record.
I think you are now like with Marty Lederman for like.
But Marty invites himself on. So that's the difference. Although I love him.
Yeah.
But Alex, thank you so much for coming.
Alex, it was great to meet you.
Yeah, it's just wonderful. Thanks.
Really enjoyed it.
So tomorrow it is just Kate and me. It being Saturday, we'll plan the show for the week. We'll chill out. I may even do it from the cabin in the woods. Sunday, Kate will bring a mystery guest.
Oh shit! It's my turn for mystery guest,
and I will try to coax out of her who it is. I figured it out last time.
It was Mike Godwin.
Yeah, it was Mike Godwin. And then we're gonna ease into the week, and we're gonna do that McGirt episode I promised you. I've got want to bring on some cool people for that, so I may push that even to later in the week to give myself a little bit of chance to to figure out who the right McGirters are. Until 22 hours and 50 minutes from now, Kate, what do we say?
We don't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, we fight about free speech on the internet. I don't know. Ben, I
Sure,
hate this new thing. I'm so
we
bad
call
at
each
this.
other Nazis.
Oh yeah. I mean, I could say that every day, but then we'd have to keep having Mike Godwin on. So
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have Mike Godwin.
It is always a pleasure. Anyways, we have to go.
We will see you tomorrow.
Bye. Thank you, Alex.